Hello and welcome to Resiliency and Recovery Report, double down on business security and business continuity, powered by StorageCraft, an ArcServe company. My name's Ed Hannon, and I'm joined today by Gary Pica, president of True Methods, and Janine Edwards, senior director, channel marketing with StorageCraft. And we're going to get started with the first segment, the state of the state. And Janine, I'm going to ask you this first question. How did MSPs survive the pandemic last year?
So we did a lot of these surveys that we called sort of pandemic pulse checks throughout sort of the heavy part of the pandemic, all through as we headed into 2021 and sort of what their outlook was. And the good news is while their end customer, especially the SMBs, certainly is still rallying. The managed service provider community did okay, right? So they felt there was a couple of things and I know I'm excited to get Gary's perspective on it, that they needed to do to sort of continue with profitability. But at the end of the day, I think the end user said, hey, if there's one thing I definitely need to make sure that I have, right, it's my technology, right? That's what keeps me competitive. I need to make sure I'm up and running. And then as things started to get a little crazy with these nefarious actors, as far as ransomware goes, it became even more critical that the SMB was relying on their outsourced technology provider to say, make sure I have a strategy to ensure that my distributed workforce, my hybrid workforce was well taken care of in this sort of extreme pivot to being able to be productive. I don't know, Gary, if you agree with that, if you have heard the same thing from your members.
Yeah, absolutely. And I get a pretty good view at this. We have over 160 or 170 companies in our peer group. So I see all of their numbers each quarter by month. So it was really interesting to look at 2020. And initially we saw, some people who were, if they weren't charging for the work from home stuff, people held off on projects. We saw this little dip, but amazingly, by the time we got to the end of the year, we saw all that revenue come back. We also saw a short blip in new client acquisition in, March, April into May. And then by the fall, the same thing. People are selling more recurring revenue at a higher price. So I think it just tells you that the TAM, the total addressable market for MSPs, is so big and it's growing so fast that this has tested the resiliency of the marketplace, and it's been positive.
Yeah, I mean, we even asked, our last one was sort of, again, like a look back at 2020, what's the outlook for 2021? And I think one of the numbers was 66% of the folks surveyed, the MSPs surveyed, said that they experienced either moderate, which we defined as 5 to 15% growth, or higher than 15% growth in 2020, right? And so, okay, what are your expectations of the future? Even more, 82% said we expect to see moderate or hyper growth in 2021. So the other thing I thought was interesting, and I'd love to hear Gary's thought on this, 81% of them expect that their average monthly contract value will increase in 2021. And I think that's interesting because they do, as we get further through the survey, and I'd love Gary's perspective, they do have to do a couple of things to the contract to make sure that they're squeezing more profitability out of that, right? You know what I'm saying, Gary? Like I kind of had to sort of take a look and tweak the contract a little bit.
I'll say this directly. If you're an MSP and you're not charging your customers more per month, more per seat than you were a year ago, you and your customers are less secure. I mean, just not just because of the tool stack, right? And we've seen tool costs go from about 10% of seat price to about 25%. But also a lot of security is hygiene, right? It's governance, it's people, it's process, and that costs money. And so I'm glad it was 81%. I would like to see it be 100%, because 100% of MSPs are charging more now, and they have to be charging more in a year. I mean, we're seeing the highest seat prices ever for core offerings, $170, $185 per seat, and they're getting it all day long right now. So that's pretty dramatic, but the market's changed dramatically and their responsibility has changed dramatically.
Right. Yeah. And I think, to that, a huge chunk, almost 40% said, yeah, we're going to indicate, we expect to see, that growth, that achieving growth for 2021 will live in the service desk, right?
Yeah.
And then 60% said, this is a big one, that we had to look at our managed offering and redesign it to make sure that we continued growth and profitability. So some interesting stats, but at the end of the day, a pretty positive outlook.
Where do MSPs see things moving 2021 and going forward?
So here's what you have to think about. In addition to work from home, you're going to see that hybrid environment stay, right? You're going to see people are going to have more flexible work schedules. But the other thing that's changed over the last year is really much more push to infrastructure moving to the cloud. So public cloud. Before, it was moving a little slower because MSPs move slow. But in general, we like to take things, more slowly. But now the customers are pushing that to happen. So you really have to think about, what does that mean to me at an MSP when I have more customers that have 30, 40, 50 employees and maybe have virtually almost no premise, equipment. Everything is either appified or it's in the cloud. What's going to be those services? And, I'm a big proponent for the past 20 years about consulting, VCIO services, because they have to be able to make better decisions. And it's also going to be more complex. So that also means that you need to be able to help them in that way. And some of the other things that we do are starting to go away. Like we held on to those premise servers and things that we did. Monitoring is different today. So I tell people, let's think about where we think the marketplace will be. We want to shoot the puck, not to where it's where it needs to be. And that's what I would say right now is that we're going to continue to see changes.
Yeah, even look at our own organizations. I think people are realizing that they can be just as productive working from home as they are in an office, right? So when you take a look at, again, that as Gary indicated, the solution providers and the managed service providers said, yeah, we definitely expect, we're going on site more, but we definitely expect, supporting these remote workers for the long term. That is a different sort of task on the help desk, right, Gary? It's just different. In addition to the servers moving to the cloud, it's more like just so much stuff that's hard to find a root cause, just a person being used to working outside of the physical environment and not sometimes knowing how to turn their computer on or like figure out why their Exchange server isn't working, right? And the help desk now has to figure out, how do I drive resolution and response just like I did on the typical stuff of the past? You know what I'm saying?
Yeah, at a time when you need to drive down your seat costs for that support component, because every dollar of cost you have there can't go into tools, it can't go into VCIO, it can't go into high value. So we have to figure out how to do this and continue to drive down our average tickets per month per end user, our reactive time per end user. So we saw a spike in that. Now we see it coming back down. But that has to be the focus. If you're, and I look at it as a ratio between, for every support resource I have that are doing all the tickets and alerts, on average, how many seats can they manage? And we want that above 400 or 500. When many people, they can only, they have 1,000 seats and they have 4 people on their support desk. So your costs are double. And right now, that's a big drag on. That's time you need to spend on security, on compliance, on VCIO that every customer is demanding. So we have to be efficient.
Yeah, and I love this idea of the VCIO getting back, into the sort of the on the front burner, right? Because we used to talk about when we were really young, Gary, but we used to talk about it, migrating to the recurring revenue model. It was all about, hey, how do you make yourself invaluable? Well, it's getting a seat at the table, right? And understanding how to solve business challenges with technology. When has that ever been more important than this minute? Right? With this continuous, ubiquitous, pervasive, all the words, right? Threat around ransomware, security is keeping, when I ask the solution providers and MSPs, what keeps you up at night? What keeps you up at night when it comes to your customers? Number 1, security. Number 2, ransomware, right? So how do you create this strategy for them and help them understand that it's not just about, securing the data, protecting the data. It's really about understanding what business resiliency, and that lies in the most critical asset, which is now data, right? So,
absolutely. And I think in the past, Janine, so much of the focus has gone about, keeping you protected. Now, what I tell people is, and we talk about it every week on my security podcast, you need to tell your customers, and you need to understand you live in an assume breach mentality. It's not a matter of if you get breached, it's a matter of when. No matter how good you are, because we've seen some breaches that are inherent. They're in Exchange, they're in SolarWinds, they're in Azure. And so you have to think right of boom when it comes to how you respond, how you recover, backup and disaster recovery to a different level than you have to, and have shared responsibility. Your customers need to understand they can't have the assumption just because they're paying you more that they're never going to have an issue. Part of what they're paying you for is how to deal with an issue, and you're reasonably trying to keep them from an issue. Does that make sense, Jeanine?
Absolutely. And just to sort of absolutely make clear in netting out what we just said, we asked the partners, where are the four places you're sort of doubling down on as it relates to your managed offering? It came to, again, supporting remote employees for the long term, cybersecurity, what you just said, migrating servers off premise and into the cloud, and additional business continuity strategies and offerings, right? So they're telling us the same thing. So if you're not doing that today, and if you're not looking at your managed offering and saying, these are the areas where I need to make sure I'm not only including in what I'm doing for customers, but charging a premium for it because you do it well, then you're missing an opportunity. Would you agree?
Yeah, and the other one that I saw in your report was that was collaboration was on there as well.
Yep. Yeah, collaboration.
Yeah. So I think that's important. And see, when you do these things better, Jeanine, not only will your customers pay you more, but when you're in front of a prospect, they allow you to have customers to ask the right questions so that customers can separate what you're doing from the other alternatives, whether it's the current vendor or other vendors. We want to be able to weaponize our competitors' low price. And the way in which you do that is having the competencies and be able to show people in everything you just talked about, Jeanine.
And then when you walk in the door, you're not saying, we're going to make sure your data is protected and that you're secure. Right. You're saying, we're going to teach you about a strategy about how to make sure that no matter what happens to you, your business is resilient, right? That's a different conversation. That's a VCIO conversation, right? And we've been talking about it for years and years and years, but right now, more than ever, it's not only most important to making sure your customers, because no one's ransomware proof. Are we agreeing with that? No one's ransomware proof. And there's no silver bullet, right? So this idea of saying, we have this shared responsibility. Let's talk about a strategy. Let's help you, implement a full strategy around, and then, hey, this is how I'm going to help you with that strategy by implementing these solutions and tools. You start with the problem, solve the problem with the technology as you drag it in, right?
Yep. And in the sales process, when you sit down, with a prospect and you start saying to them, hey, so your current vendor, when they had the last conversation with you about your resilience, did they talk about what are these three things? How would you do this? How long? What would be the process? The order in which it, and every time, almost every time, my customers tell me that when they're in front of a prospect, there's almost always a blank glazed look because they haven't had those conversations with their current vendor. So number one, that's going to help you in sales. But if someone else comes in and asks those questions of your customers, they better get the right answer because they're prospecting for your customers too.
Right. This was an amazing stat to me, just kind of drilling down a little bit into this particular piece about this whole strategy about, data and business resiliency. 67% of all the folks who responded to our Outlook and Look Forward survey said that less than half of their customers have a documented DRAS or business continuity plan in place.
Listen, as I like to say, this is the best time, and I've owned MSPs for 25 years. This is the best time in history to be an MSP for about 25% of you. And that's the reason why. Because if you're in that people who answered that bottom, that 50% of their customers, I'm saying bridge out, turn back.
Yeah. And then the other piece that was interesting was that the amount of partners, and not because, they're dumb, but the amount of partners who didn't require, going back to what you just said, for them to have testing and debriefing on their disaster recovery plan that they implemented. It wasn't required. It absolutely should be required, and you should charge for it because that's a business conversation, right? That's an expectation setting conversation, right?
if you're working with True Methods, you better be answering those questions properly. Or, Janine, I'm not shy. I'm not afraid to call our customers out and tell them to get moving.
Yeah. I mean, it was surprising to me. It's kind of like, and then not to even mention, we asked the partners, hey, do you have a business continuity plan in place?
Yeah.
That number also surprised me. That whole like cobbler has no shoes sort of argument, right? And now as managed service providers also have become a ridiculous target for these ransomware folks because they know they can hit up their entire, customer base. You better have a business continuity plan in place, a disaster recovery plan in place, an incident response plan in place, like that,
But I do want to move forward in a sort of slightly different direction, Gary, and
Go ahead.
talk to you for a couple minutes about where you see things headed in 2021. I'm going to start with the distributed workforce. Do you see that continuing now going forward? How far out into the future do you see that being a reality?
Not only just talking to MSPs, I do a lot of reading on this, and I read some stuff on real estate because I think that is one of the predictors, and I think we're pretty much assured that there's going to be flexible work environments. I mean, that's the way people want to work, and even though some employers right now are thinking, well, that's not when we're in the office, they're not going to get to make that choice because they're going to go work for someone else. And a lot of people, especially in their 30s, 20s and 30s, that's more important to them than money. They not having 45-minute drive to work back and forth is more important to them than making an extra $10,000 or $15,000. So I definitely see that trend continuing, Ed.
It feels a lot to me, Gary, in some ways like the startup boom, the VC boom, where it was like, the casual workplace and, all these, like, we're going to put pool tables in the office. And it was this idea like, and then that sort of morphed into, well, we got to protect work-life balance. So we can't just have everybody herd to the office for everything. Now now it's going to be more fluid. It's going to be flexible. And I think, like you said, I think the market sort of is moving in that direction. So I'm dead on board with you.
Yeah.
Ginny, it sounds like you feel the same way.
Yeah, I mean, how many times have I heard, or you heard, all of us heard, I'm actually more productive at home. You know what I mean? Like I'm actually working maybe more hours at home, right? Or productivity doesn't always have to happen from the hours of 8 to 5, right? So I don't know about you guys, but I often come down here, before I go to bed and check email one last time. I know that's not a great work-life balance, but I'm saying like, I do think that folks are realizing, like Gary said, the flexibility is important, but also productivity is not necessarily, compromised with a distributed workforce.
I think it's higher. Honestly, I think it's much higher because you don't have those casual side conversations like, hey, let's go grab lunch or let's go get a coffee. It's literally turn computer on, sit in front of the computer,
Right.
meetings, work, turn computer off for a while, dinner, come back. There's no third week. It's like A or B, work or
Right.
not.
Yeah, and listen, how this is going to end up really being, we're not going to know for years because
Right.
the other side of it is culture, but all of it, we can assume as IT providers that we have to assume everyone's working from home because if they're working from home one day a week, it might as well be every day because we have to secure them and manage them in the same way. So we have to work under that assumption that they're going to have more things on different apps, more things on public cloud. Just the assumption that you have to make right now, Ed.
And what security challenges, Gary, come with that when you have that distributed workforce? What you talked about some of that right there, but can you sort of expound on that a little bit?
Listen, we for decades we built it around an edge device. Okay. And so when you think about that now, you go home, we had content control, we had edge devices. Now they go there, they're on a work computer or they're on a personal computer, and they have your company data there. Okay. And they can click on whatever they want. So securing that endpoint is so important. And then you think about public cloud. When you think about, configuring a firewall in the cloud, it's a completely different process, right? And so it's more complex, takes a different skill set, also has advantages, right? You can make changes and upgrades, across it. And then the same thing when you think about how you back up, Janine, you have to think about it, right, in a different kind of way because we have data in different places, including sometimes, even though we don't want it, maybe with those users.
Yeah, for sure.
How does existing technology, or I guess I should say, ensure that MSPs can solve customer challenges?
So I tell you what's really great right now is for MSPs, they're getting to learn more about their customers' businesses. They almost can't help them right now if they don't learn more about what the challenges are, with those customers. And so how people are going to run their businesses, how they're going to build culture. That's why, Janine, interesting, you mentioned collaboration. Like our job is to use technology to help our customers achieve their goals. All of their goals are changing right now. So we're in that period where we have to develop a lot of different skill sets to be able to, create an environment that's secure, that's productive, that's collaborative in a way that they can find their way over these next couple of years, the same way that we have to find our way about what this looks like moving forward.
Yeah, not to mention the data that's collected in the collaboration tools, right? Teams, SharePoint. That's different than, that's the Office data isn't necessarily protected by, Microsoft, right? So it's like, do you have a strategy, as an outsourced technology partner to your customers to make sure that no matter what kind of data it is, the size of the data, where it lives, that it's protected and recoverable, right? So data is sort of the most common denominator across all the things. And common denominator is probably not the right word. It's the most critical asset to not only the customer, but also to the partner, because they have to figure out how to appropriately manage, store, protect, recover, right? So
based on the client's priorities. So you need to be
right.
having that conversation of all of their data, where it is, how it's prioritized, and asking separate questions. Okay, what if this was compromised? What if it was exfiltrated? How long could you be? What's your priorities on this? I mean, people are really thinking about it now after the most recent, Exchange exploit.
Yeah.
And people are saying, like, how long will we be without mail? And that's a conversation you should have already had with your customer, right, ahead of time.
It's a whole
And
strategy.
Janine,
It's like we talked about. It's a strategy.
Yeah, and we still see a lot of partners. They're not backing up Office 365. They think,
Microsoft's doing it.
Yeah, and they haven't. I guess they never read that EULA.
30
right?
days, I think it is. I think they do it for 30 days, and then they're like, sorry. Yeah.
So, Janine, I want to come back to you for this next segment. It's called, it's not ransomware, it's ransom when and how much. And Gary sort of talked about this before, but from your seat, what are MSPs identifying as the biggest threat to their customers right now?
Well, it's obviously ransomware, right? And it's different kinds of ransomware. It's like the number one is probably malware, phishing, and then thinking about the ransomware from the MSP perspective, the vulnerability presented. You hear all the SolarWinds, infiltration through an RMM, the MSP, any kind of integration sort of road, connecting point, is a possible vulnerability, right? And then of course there's, as we've talked about, this work, as Gary just talked about, the edge, right? Outside the perimeter, work from home folks, distributed environments, or even larger customers, remote office, branch office, right? Sort of bringing these increased blind spots and vulnerabilities. Employees that are working at home doing, misconfiguration, things that they didn't mean to do, mistaking it, outdated security, believe it or not. So, but obviously the number one still, and probably for the near and long term, is ransomware. They're getting more savvy. They're getting more, they're doing crazier stuff with the, threatening the data, right? And they're just going to continue to do that. The stat on ransomware, I believe it's like ransomware will cost the globe something like $20 billion by the end of this year.
It's now has a higher, volume in dollars than the drug trade.
Yeah. And again, it's not just about the ransomware, it's also about the amount of data that's being produced, right? And people don't think about that. You think about, ransomware, but now you have this sort of two types of data. There's structured data and there's unstructured data, right? And the unstructured data is now sort of run of business everyday stuff, pictures, videos, if you're, and all kinds, it hits every vertical. So they're like, well, what do I do with this data? And like Gary said, what has to come up fast? It's not so much about the structured data. It's what do we do to store and manage the unstructured data? This stat drives me crazy. 200 zettabytes of data by 2025. And most of the data, 90%, I think is the stat of the data that's in the world has been produced in the last 2 years. It's not just something that the enterprise customer is dealing with, right? So what that it's trickling down all the way to the S, right, of the SMB. And it's not about, it's more data to protect, more data to recover, right? And these ransomware bad actors are just excited about it. It excites them, right? It's like a challenge to how we get to it. And I think that it's going to continue to be pervasive. There's all kinds of scary stats, but as we talked about before, there is no silver bullet. You must use sort of this multimodal approach. And the biggest piece of the puzzle is making sure that you understand, just as Gary said, what's important to the customer, be up and running quickly so that they remain productive, competitive, and profitable should they be compromised, and they most likely will be compromised.
Because Ed, some of this is not a technology issue. Some of this, before you get to the technology and what you do and how you look at it and back it up, it's policy. Like there's so much shadow IT now compared to a year ago. It's just like some of it is the companies have to have a policy of what employees can and can't do, where they put things, what devices they could use. Then you have to have a way to help them enforce that, because we can't protect data that we don't know about or things that are outside. So, this is governance, it's discipline, and that's not something that MSPs historically have been their strong suit, and it needs to be now moving forward.
It used to be like, is the data protected? Check. Is the data recoverable? Check. Now it's about, how is the data protected? How fast can we get it up? And where does the data live? And hey, are you going to be able to be running your business in what amount of time? And that expectation needs to be set with each and every customer. It shouldn't be a blind, it should be, okay, we tested it, we talked about it, you know what's going to happen should you get compromised in this way.
Yeah, it makes perfect sense. I mean, when you think of the explosion of data and the proliferation of endpoints, it's literally more things to attack in more places to get it. So It's not like there's one computer with all the data and that's it. It's everywhere on every device all the time. Remote working hasn't helped it. It's made it worse because, to the point you made earlier, there's more people working more times in more places. So it's literally everywhere. And to the point you both made, the more it is, the more spots you can get in, and that makes it just really bad.
Yeah, I was talking to a cyber insurance person, and they said, their breaches they had to deal with insurance were up 600% over the past, 12 months and climbing 600%.
Yep. And then some of those verticals are even more in danger of being exposed. Think about the medical data. Now, I think I heard that now ransomware attacks are threatening to take the data, put it online. I mean, that's what, we have to make sure that we're doing everything we can as vendors and MSPs to, try to continue this good fight against these terrible, nefarious people, right? That are making a lot of money from it.
We used to think of, kids with hoodies in the basement. And now these are sponsored actors and businesses that are bigger and more complex and have a more mature business model than MSPs and their customers, right? And data exfiltration, even a couple of years ago was the exception to the rule. Now it's the rule. They're in for a long time, and before they make their move, they've already exfiltrated data. So thinking about that ahead of time is it's job one.
All right, so I got a couple of minutes left. I'm going to ask each of you one question. Gary, I'm going to go with you first, and then we're going to go to Janine. So Gary, how can MSPs, given all we've talked about so far and things that we haven't talked about, how can an MSP or MSP sustain and drive profitability?
Okay, so they got to do something that they haven't been good at in the past. They have to understand their cost drivers. So you have to be able to look and understand, based on not just your tools, but based on the roles and functions in your business: VCIO, support desk, governance, centralized services running your tools. You have to know what your average cost per seat is. I call that peakonomics. And so that you can predictably set a price, right? Regardless of what your pricing calculator looks like, set an average price that you can drive what we want to see, which is at least 70% gross margins. And when it's moving fast like it is now, Ed, where you're doing more and you have more tools, if you don't have command over how to match that up, you're going to go sideways. That's why 25% of the marketplace is at or below break even right now after a true owner's salary. That's not a good place to be at this point.
Janine, let me bring this home. How can StorageCraft solutions boost the MSP bottom line that we've been talking about in today's program?
Well, that's a great question. I mean, I think Gary will agree with me that outside of all the things we've been talking about, standardization, or as Gary I think calls it, technology standards, driving technology standards, right, are very important to the efficiencies and operational maturity of an MSP, right? So they know that, most of them, or the smart ones know that, right? And they know the more that they standardize, the more they're able to sort of drive subject matter experts, make sure that, again, the things we talked about, tickets, escalation, ticket cycling is down, that all the help desk is driven on efficiencies. And in this particular category, believe it or not, 67% of most managed service providers say they work with 3 or more data protection vendors, right? That's not really on them, it's on us as the technology vendor, because there's a perception that there is a gap across all the competitive set, right?
Yeah.
So we felt that. We know it's our job, especially right now, to help them drive profitability. So we've been kind of deep in innovation mode. And recently, especially with our merger with ArcServe, we've created this entire solution set that spans the entire category. So whether you're an MSP, and serving the S or the M, moving up a little bit more to project, all the way to sort of the traditional VAR, you have this set of solutions that are built on this common data, protection platform that allow you to say, no matter who my customer is of today or tomorrow, I have the right fit solution that does all of the things that are needing to be done for that particular customer's environment, whether it's appliance-based, right, compact appliance-based, software only, our third-party cloud that's been built specifically for disaster recovery, our SaaS-based protection, all the way up to our larger appliances that are really more about storing data, managing data, et cetera. We've said, okay, it's our job to make sure that the partner knows really and feels confident that this particular vendor, in this case us, StorageCraft, has anything that we need, and all of it can be managed by one pane of glass, right? And so that's important to us. And again, understanding that every customer looks different as far as their environment, their complexity, and frankly, the solution provider community looks different. Like MSPs want to buy subscription, some other folks want to buy perpetual. We wanted to create a place that says, hey, no matter what I need today for my business or for my customer, I know StorageCraft has it for me. Driving standardization, optimizing standardization for the partners is important to us.
Excellent. Excellent. Gary, Janine, thank you both. Thank you all for watching today's program. Once again, my name is Ed Hannon, and I'd like to thank you all for watching Resiliency and Recovery Report. Double down on business security and business continuity, powered by StorageCraft and ArcServe Company. Thanks for watching. Have a wonderful day.